Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something that really forces us to look in the mirror and question the very foundations of right and wrong. We're talking about William Faulkner's 1939 classic, Barn Burning. And let me tell you, this is definitely not just some simple tale about arson. It is this intense, visceral journey into a young boy's agonizing moral awakening in a totally flawed world.
So let's kick things off by putting ourselves in someone else's shoes for a second. Imagine being just 10 years old. You rely completely on your family for literally everything: food, shelter, your actual survival. Now imagine being forced to choose between protecting your father, who you absolutely know is committing crimes, and honoring the fundamental truth of what's right and wrong. I mean, it's an impossible choice, right?
And that impossible choice is perfectly crystallized in this one line. You've got to learn to stick to your own blood no matter what. Just feel the chilling weight of that command. Those are the cold, hard words spoken by Abner Snopes to his young son Sardi. To Abner, family loyalty isn't just, a nice idea, it is the absolute law. It completely overrides any concept of truth or justice. This single sentence really sets up the core thematic conflict we'll be exploring today.
But before we watch all this conflict unfold, we should briefly touch on the architect of the story. William Faulkner, born back in 1897, was an absolute titan of modernist literature, eventually taking home the Nobel Prize. He's legendary for exploring the American South, its history, its traditions, and especially the deep-seated moral struggles and the intense racial and class tensions in those decades right after the Civil War.
So Faulkner sets this story in his famous, totally fictional Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi. And it's a world defined by a really rigid, frankly brutal post-Civil War class system. On one side, you've got these wealthy landowners. On the other, the poor tenant farmers working the land just to survive day by day. And trapped right at the very bottom of this bitter, unequal hierarchy is the highly volatile Snopes family, living a life of just constant instability.
Part 1. The Weight of Blood Loyalty and the First Courtroom Test.
Let's see exactly how this harsh environment shapes our characters by jumping right into the first major conflict. The story kicks off in a place that is pretty far from a traditional hall of justice. It's a small, dusty country store that's basically doubling as a makeshift courtroom. Young Sardi Snopes is sitting there on a nail keg. He's hungry, he's absolutely terrified, and he's surrounded by the harsh, judging stares of total strangers. His father, Abner, is actually on trial. A landowner named Mr. Harris is accusing Abner of burning down his barn after a messy dispute over a runaway hog. But Harris has no actual proof, so what does he do? He turns to the 10-year-old boy. He fully expects Sardi to testify against his own dad.
As Sardi feels every single eye in that little store turning toward him, this intense psychological battle just rages inside of him. On one hand, you have Abner's rigid demand, absolute complicity, and blind loyalty to blood, right or wrong. But totally opposing that is Sardi's desperate, hidden dream. He really yearns for a world rooted in honesty and fairness. He desperately wants to obey his father, but his conscience is pulling him completely in the opposite direction.
Ultimately, the judge dismisses the charge simply because there just isn't enough evidence to convict. But make no mistake, he knows Abner is trouble. So the verdict? The judge orders the Snopes family to leave the county. Now, for Sardi, this is incredibly complex. On the one hand, he feels this massive wave of relief because he didn't have to get on the stand and lie to protect his dad. But on the other hand, he's carrying this deep, lingering shame because he knows his father is guilty in spirit, even if not in the eyes of the law.
Moving on to part 2, the escalation, the white rug incident. So, that very night, the family packs up their shabby wagon once again. But if you think Abner's destructive patterns are over, they are just getting started. When they finally arrive at the estate of Major Despain, the visual contrast is absolutely stark. You have the Snopes family arriving in ragged clothes in a battered wagon, and they are met by this grand mansion with massive white columns and perfectly manicured fields. It's essentially a physical embodiment of all the wealth and power that Abner Snopes so deeply, deeply resents. And this brings us to what we can really only call a totally calculated insult. Just walk through this sequence with me for a second. First, Abner deliberately steps in fresh horse manure, marches straight into the mansion, and tracks it all over this incredibly expensive white rug. When a servant orders him to clean it, Abner kind of pretends to comply, but instead, he uses this harsh lye soap and sharp stones, scrubbing the rug until it's completely frayed and entirely ruined. In response, Major Despain demands a crushing 20-bushel corn fine, and what's absolutely vital to understand here is that the ruined rug isn't just some property damage, it is a literal physical manifestation of Abner's class warfare.
Which brings us to part 3, the breaking point.
The gathering storm.
So Abner actually takes this fine to court. A judge reduces it to 10 bushels, but honestly, it's nowhere near enough to soothe Abner's deeply wounded pride. He feels cheated, he feels humiliated. That evening, the family is sitting at supper in this suffocating, tense silence. Sardi looks over at his father and recognizes this specific, absolutely terrifying look in his eyes. And then, Abner speaks. "Fetch the oil can." Sardi just freezes. This is the ultimate signal. He knows exactly what this means. His father's self-defeating rage has finally peaked, and he is going to burn Major Despain's barn.
Sardi is suddenly staring right into the crucible of his young life. His mother and his older brother try to physically hold him back, terrified he's going to betray the family. But Sardi has finally reached his moral awakening. He knows that destroying people's livelihoods and food is just inherently wrong. So in this explosive moment of sheer willpower, Sardi breaks completely from his mother's grasp. He sprints out into the dark night, rushing as fast as he can toward the mansion to warn Major Despain.
He bursts right through the Major's door, shouting his warning at the top of his lungs, and instantly the whole night erupts into utter chaos. Major Despain grabs his horse and charges out. Picture the absolute sensory overload here, the pounding of heavy hooves, the violent creaking of saddle leather, the rushing wind. And then, 3 sharp gunshots ring out in the darkness. Sardi doesn't actually see it happen, but he knows. The violent, destructive life of Abner Snopes is almost certainly over.
This leads us to our final section, Part 4, A Lonely Freedom, and our thematic takeaways.
Sardi stops running. The immediate chaotic danger has passed, and we're left with just the quiet aftermath. Let's unpack what Sardi's massive decision actually means by looking at how the core themes of the story perfectly intersect here. First up, we've got loyalty versus justice, Sardi's ultimate agonizing choice to obey his conscience rather than become complicit in his father's crimes. Then there's class conflict, that deep-seated resentment between the poor tenant farmers and the wealthy elite that constantly drove Abner's desperate acts of arson. Next is the cycle of violence. Abner's total inability to let go of his rage doomed his family to constant movement and ultimately tragedy. And finally, coming of age. Sardi just isn't a little boy anymore. This single traumatic moral choice forced a really sudden and incredibly painful step into adulthood.
And Sardi doesn't go back to his family's wagon. Instead, he just turns and walks away into the quiet of the dark woods. Lying there under the stars, he feels this extremely complex mix of grief for his father, sure, but also a profound relief. The cycle of barn burning has finally ended. He has achieved a profound moral freedom. But man, it is deeply isolating. He has literally left everything he knows behind.
Which really leaves us with this final thought to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer. Sardi Snopes found the incredible courage to break a generational cycle of violence and class resentment. He chose truth, and he chose justice. But looking at the haunting reality of a 10-year-old boy walking entirely alone into the dark woods, at what cost? Doing what is right is so often celebrated, but Faulkner reminds us that when it means betraying your own blood, the price of justice can be a lifetime of loneliness. So what would you have done? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time as we keep unpacking the fascinating layers of the world's greatest stories.